Okay, hi everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started, although we may hear a few tones as people chime in a little bit later, as they just did. So bear with us. My name is Tracy Crow. I think I know and recognize everyone. And Judith Stanton is also with us today, who is going to be co-leading this little discussion. And is there anyone I know? I know everybody. Okay. We all know one another. Yay. Hi, everybody. Okay. So what we thought we would do is we would discuss for about an hour what it means to read as a writer. I think and one of the things that sparked this off is Judith and I were having a conversation a while back about how we're running across so many writers who frankly feel they don't have time to read, or that will be one of their reasons for not really reading as much anymore as they used to, or they feel kind of guilty that if they're spending that time reading, then they should be writing. So one of the things that we wanted to dispel is that they really go hand in hand. I mean, this is really, really a marriage of the two. And Stephen King talks about this in his book, what is it called? On Writing, which he says, if you're not going to read, then don't even try to be a writer, basically. You should be reading as much as you're writing, if not more, because there is that process of osmosis that we pick up as we're reading. We pick up things like pacing. We pick up things like the distribution between exposition and dialogue, depending upon the genres that we're writing in. And these are some of the things that we start to pick up and learn the more that we're reading. And so that's why all the best writers will talk about the importance of reading, 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 reading. Another reason is because it makes us a good literary citizen of the world. If we're not going to read, how do we expect there to be readers out there to read our books one day? Right? So that's part of it as well. It's about being a literary citizen of the world. It's about teaching ourselves. And Judith, what would you like to say about one of the reasons why we decided to have this discussion?
Well, all of the above, absolutely. The osmosis part is really important. Sometimes I think I hear people worry that if they read other writing, it will mess with their personal style. And I've not found that to be true for myself. I think if you're reading, it was true in graduate school. I remember reading Virginia Woolf and writing a paper on her and sounding like Virginia Woolf. But I hadn't developed my writerly voice at that time in my life because I was only writing papers. But it's important to read, and at some point we're going to talk about strategies for reading, for working in more of your reading. But I think we may be ready to go look at some of our author of Lisa Wingate's wonderful writing.
Did anyone have a chance to read the first 50 pages?
Oh, sure.
Some of you did, huh?
Y'all are good.
Yes.
Yes. So, okay. So, I mean, even if you did not get a chance, certainly we encourage you to go read this book for all the quality that it is. But you'll still draw, I think, a lot from today's discussion based on a lot of the elemental things that we'll cover. And so then maybe we'll spark your interest to dive in and go read some of Wingate's work. So this book was actually chosen by Judith because she had such a fit over how beautiful it is and just so many things that are going on within the book. So before we get started into kind of a breakdown, is there anything anyone would like to offer in terms of just like initial reactions to what they've read so far, just an overall? Don't have to get very specific. Tom?
I'd like to say that I ended up reading the whole book. Did I do wrong?
No. We were afraid that if we said you had to read the whole book, nobody would show up today.
No, the question I had is I was curious because if I'm correct, it's written in present tense, and we talked about books written in present and past tense.
Yeah, I mean, present tense novels, as I have said in some of our craft, Tuesday night sessions, is not a favorite. It's not a favorite of editors, publishers. It's not a favorite of readers. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it comes across too gimmicky. Sometimes it helps when we have a story like 3 different narratives going on where we're telling part of it in the past and we're telling part of it in the present. So that is sometimes a way of helping the reader differentiate faster when we're changing a point of view. But sometimes the entire novel will be told in present tense. I will tell you that I've had a number of publishers get a book that was written in present tense, and almost every single time they've said, please send this back to me in past tense.
Wow.
I've never had an editor say, please try present tense. Never. So if it works when the editor gets it, then the editor isn't going to question it. But most of the time, it's going to grate on something, and they're going to think that maybe if it were in past tense, it might be more readable, more accessible, and might be more marketable. But yeah, you're right. You're right to question that because we've talked about that before.
But I do think with Wingate's book that particularly having Hanny's voice in speaking in present tense makes it easier for us as readers to accept and kind of revel in her dialect. I mean, it's just we're hearing her speaking voice all the time. And I think it also underlines, for me at least, her youth and naivete.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it for her more than Benny. And I was fine with Benny too, but great question, Tom.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, obviously I've said this many, many times. But when it works, it works. And sometimes you'll find an agent and an author who are so believing in what they've achieved on the page that will be their sticking point, and that they may just say that may be the hill that they're willing to die on in some cases. This is not Wingate's first novel. So she's got a reputation. She's able to bring in some market share. That also helps. That also
gives her some
Tom?
freedom.
Were you going to say something else?
One other question. Is it good to write in a dialect? I was told differently somewhere along the line that it's not a good idea.
It's iffy if it's written too heavy, because it's especially if you are a white person writing in a Black dialect with that vernacular, it can appear as if you're appropriating a culture. And there's a lot of that going on right now. And so that kind of surprised me as well, because of knowing what's happening since, what is the story? American Dirt came out, and there was all this big, hullabaloo about appropriation of other cultures. So you do have to be careful. I think if you write it almost where it becomes too cliche, then you're going to have problems. If it's necessary because of the time era, then I think you're safe, and I think you're okay with it.
Yeah. To me, Wingate's use of dialect was, she explains in notes in the back that she very carefully researched the dialect that she used. And it just really brought that world to life for me. And one of the passages we're going to look at has some specific dialect that just lit me up. It's so remarkable and authentic sounding.
I passed on a novel that the premise was excellent. And I passed on it because it was all written in a very heavy, thick dialect. The man's a white man from Texas, and the whole novel was written this way in the South. And I just thought, I first of all, it was very hard to read because there was nothing that gave me any kind of break or anything. And it was so thick and heavy that I almost felt like I was mimicking or something, it just didn't feel comfortable. And I felt almost like he was making fun of them, though he certainly wasn't, but it just did not come across right. This came across right.
Yeah.
So I think there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. In a novella that I wrote called Cooper's Hawk, most people don't realize that the protagonist is actually an African American Vietnam veteran. But if you know that and then you read his dialogue, you go, ah, I see it now. I see it. It's just a turn of a phrase or just a word or something, or just, you know, the way the syntax is. It just gives you the slightest little hint. But even I was a nervous wreck over it. And so then when I would ask people who are my beta readers, well, you know, do you see Willis being black or white? And they said, well, he's white, isn't he? And then, you know, if a black reader read it, she would say, oh yeah, he's black. Definitely. I picked up on it. I heard the tone. You know, I recognized it. You know, it's like my uncle talking to me or something. So you do have to be very, very careful.
Interesting.
Any other general observations or questions that anybody would like to offer or throw out there before we get into maybe some of the specifics? Yes, Linda.
I was going to say that when I wrote my children's book about the woman who forced the desegregation of public libraries in Virginia, I took it to the Black community and I asked several of them to read the manuscript and give me feedback on it. And I was glad because there was more than, you know, a children's book, you're dealing with only 32 pages, but there was more than one incident when they said to me, Black person here in Virginia in 1955 would have never said that. So,
Wow.
you know, and this is the town that I had been living in for 50 years, felt like I knew everything historically really well, but of course you're not part of that community. So it was over an ice cream cone that seemed so insignificant. But had I not changed it, it would have never been authentic. So just throwing that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can remember going to a reading, and maybe I've told this story before, down at Eckerd College when one of our alums, Dennis Lehane, who wrote Mystic River, he was reading for us that night, packed auditorium, and he was trying out a section within a novel that had yet to be sold. And when he went from the white person to the Black person, he was reading in that dialect out loud. And it was so thick and heavy, and he's got a very Boston accent. So he was trying to pull this off, and it went flat. It went sour. And his agent walked up to me afterward. And I don't know why she walked up to me, because I was like, at the time, I was nobody. I mean, it's like 20 years ago, I think, and 15 years ago. And she said, I want to ask you something. What did you think when he read from the dialect? And I said, he's got to cut that. Way too heavy. It was terrible. And I said, he can use certain pieces, but it can't be that heavy. It's almost like he's making fun of them or something.
Yeah,
And it's just too much.
condescending.
And so he did. I mean, I don't know if, you know, who finally got through to him, but somebody did, and he changed it. And there's a little bit of the dialect, you can pick it up, a little bit of the vernacular, but it's not so much where it's almost like you're trying to draw attention to it, like you're trying to make, I don't know, it comes across wrong, insensitive, an appropriation, a wrong appropriation of culture if it's not done correctly. So these are things you have to think about when you've got different characters in your books. I'm not somebody who believes that it's wrong. If I paid attention so much to culture appropriation worries, then the only thing I would ever be allowed to write would be from a white woman's perspective who had been a Marine Corps public affairs officer and mother of one. I mean, you know, that means that I could never write about a soldier who's been to war and experienced combat. You know, so we can take this whole culture appropriation thing just way too far, way, way, way too far. Any other general observations or questions anyone wants to bring up? Yeah, Penny.
I really had a hard time with this book, getting over sort of the white savior complex of this affluent woman coming into this poor Black town to save these children from their history and help them discover their history. And it just seemed like the movie Dangerous Minds from the early 90s. It just felt a little trite to me, the premise of the book. So I'm really curious to hear, Judith and Tracy, your views on the craft element of it, because I think that's probably very well done. But the storyline itself, I just thought had been played out before.
You mean Benny's story?
Yeah.
as a lifelong teacher, I completely bought it just because she walked into the worst classroom situation, far worse than anything I'd ever encountered. And I felt like Wingate really nailed the emotional turmoil that she had to be in. And I wasn't thinking of it, and I'm sure you've got a good point, and it could readily be seen that way, but I was on Benny's side.
For me, it created flashbacks of my one year as a 9th and 10th grade English teacher in an inner city school in St. Petersburg, Florida. I did not go in there with any sort of savior complex. I just went in there to have a job. And because, the teacher I was replacing for that single year, her son had hit a telephone pole in the middle of the night in his car, and he had brain damage, and she needed to take off a year. So I just walked in there, had no idea what I was doing, had never taught public school a day in my life. And there I am in an inner city school. So with race riots going on like 4 or 5 blocks down the street from me. And my students coming in saying, "Don't go to the mall tonight, Miss Crow. There's going to be something going on. Don't go to the mall." So it's crazy. But there were fights every day. There was all this stuff going on. And not once did I ever think I was there to save anything. I was just there to do a job and survive and do the best job I could. But darn it, I made them read Julius Caesar, and they loved it. One of my students, who had been the most resistant, walked out one day, and he gave me this big old hug. His name was Juba. And I'll never forget Juba. He said, "Miss Crow, I just want you to know I can speak Shakespeare now." Like, "I know you can, Juba. You got it. You can speak Shakespeare now." Oh, it was a fun year. It was crazy. Fun year. But Penny, I hear what you're saying. Yeah. That has been done, and that's kind of the problem in every novel. If you're dealing at all to some degree with race, and you've got like this kind of thing going on, that's always going to be one of the levels of criticism that you either overcome because your book is that good or whatever, or you find a new, fresh way of depicting it. But that's always going to be a concern, and it always should be a concern. Any other general comments? Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, one other thing. I read it on Kindle. I hope nobody frowns at that, but
No, are you kidding? I have mine right here.
but it can get confusing sometimes because you don't know where you're at. But am I right in assuming the opening part of the book was really the ending to those who read the book?
The opening part was the ending.
It's repeated.
Yeah,
Oh,
repeated.
Mhm.
Okay. And to those who do read it in Kindle, you got to be careful because they show the ad, and you can't hardly read it, and you got to click and
You have to click on it. Yeah, I saw
and
that.
if you're
Yeah.
not careful and you click, you end up somewhere else in the story. So just a warning.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right. Shall we talk a little bit more specifics then about craft
Yeah.
and how writers can actually learn even more by piecing, taking pieces out? Let me do a share screen. Now, when I do this, I'm only going to be able to see 3 or 4 of you. So if there's anything anyone wants to add, jump in, comment on, then just unmute yourself and speak up, okay? Because I won't see you if you're waving or anything. All right, where's my share screen? There we go. Okay. All right. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay. I tried to make it a little bigger in font. Is it readable?
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks,
Yes.
Bonnie. Thank you, Bonnie. Okay. So just, we talk about this all the time, and we forget that every artist, whether writer, painter, musician, where everybody's studying craft. Sometimes we feel like that unless we're sitting in a classroom and we're being talked to and expected to respond, or, we have a lesson we have to turn in, sometimes we forget that it's okay to continue to study craft. I mean, just outside of the classroom, So I think about my mother, and I think about artists I know, and when they look at a painting, they're immediately analyzing the brush strokes. They're immediately analyzing the technique, the stroke intensity, the composition, and other lots and lots and lots of other craft related artistry elements I'm not even aware of. But they're studying everybody's, whether it's, you know, a fellow artist or it's one of the masters. That's what they're looking at. I mean, yes, they can look at it, but they don't just look at it and go, they're studying every little thing about that. And it's the same with a musician. A musician who's very serious is going to be listening and analyzing the notes and the rhythm and all the things that go into musical composition. Writers, we do the same thing. But because writing is so, I mean, because reading is so much a part of our regular life, like whether we're reading the back of a can, whether we're reading a recipe, we think of reading as we're just reading. Reading is like an end to a means to an end, or whatever that saying is. And so we don't often realize that we've got to be reading as artists in the same way that other artists are analyzing their own craft. So here are some of the craft elements. And, you know, in the world of writing, a lot of people will break these down into 3 tiers. I will tell you, I don't necessarily agree with, you know, some of the second and third tier being lesser than the first tier, but let's just take a look at it for what the so-called experts call it. These are our basic craft elements, and then these are writing elements. So the craft elements go into basically that who, what, where, the overall storytelling. And so in our first tier, of course, there's got to be character, plot, and a setting. Okay? Those 3 must be there. Then we have a second tier, and this is one of the first things I don't agree with. To me, point of view is like the most significant decision that a writer will ever make. But I suppose they do have to have the character first, so I can let that go. But point of view is obviously very important. And there are a lot of editors who may love a first person novel manuscript, but then they really don't feel good about it because it's first person, and they might send it back to the reader and say, could you send me the first couple of chapters in third person? Because I really think this would be more marketable and it would be more readable overall if it were in third person. Remember, I've told you before that a lot of editors will shy away. In fact, they'll just flat out refuse in most cases to even review a debut novel that's written in first person point of view. They don't like it. They feel like everyone they've ever seen has always been too full of holes. And because the writer is writing basically what they know. And they don't understand enough about craft yet to know, because if it's first person, it's got to be written like a memoir. And memoir is one of the hardest genres in the world to write. You've got to know how to fill in holes, because we seem to think that it's all a part of the story is already on the page when it's really in our mind. And it's not on the page yet. And so that's why it's full of holes. So that's why a lot of editors will refuse to read debut novels that are written in first person point of view, because they automatically assume it's what the writer knows. So it's going to be full of holes. Right or wrong, that's what they believe. So, so we have in the second tier, we have point of view, we have theme. Theme is one of those craft elements that we don't go in to hammer in. Theme is one of those craft elements that sometimes emerges from the writing itself. It almost reveals itself as we're writing. So theme is attached to a human emotion. Theme could be grief. Okay. Theme could be joy about something, or, you know, or whatever, but theme is usually attached to an emotion, a human emotion. And it's usually something that unfolds in the writing. And then once we realize that that theme is showing up, then we might go back in and see where we can further implant that theme to make sure that it resonates stronger, that it's definitely being picked up along the way in the thread. Also in the second tier is style. And this is where diction, you know, like that vernacular comes in, the syntax, the pacing meaning how fast we're going to move the reader through this story. What we do know is that commercial fiction tends to move faster. Pacing wise than literary fiction. Commercial fiction would be your genres of romance, sci-fi. Typically, there's a lot of blurred lines nowadays, and there's going to be a lot more dialogue and a lot less exposition. Literary fiction, you can almost recognize it if you were to hold a book 4 or 5 feet away and open it up to any page, and if you see a lot of text, a lot of dense text, chances are that's literary. Okay, because it's more about the interior of characters that's going on rather than short paragraphs, dialogue, short paragraphs, dialogue. You know, that's that faster paced commercial fiction that's moving us along. But what we will see and what we are seeing is that a lot of really excellent writers are kind of blurring those lines and bringing them together now. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then tone. We could have a grief memoir. I mean, we could have a grief novel based in theme, but the tone might be really surprisingly lighthearted or humorous. Does that make sense? I mean, the overall theme could be about grief, but it could be about this widow who's out having the time of her life, or making herself try to have the time of her life, and running into one, you know, challenge after another that's absolutely slapstick hilarious. But the theme is about grief. Make sense? Okay. So then in our third tier, we look at things like dialogue, action. You know, we want our characters doing something, not just sitting in a room, sitting in a chair, as Judith was pointing out the other day, standing in a doorway, you know, doing nothing. We want them to have some sort of action that they're doing. Descriptions. This was in description, I get into a lot of like the details of characterization. Exposition is that material that is moving us from point A to point B. We have to have a certain amount of all of the action, the description. It all falls into exposition. Conflict, we've talked about conflict before in some of our other Tuesday night craft sessions, and I'm sure some of these too, where there are 4 basic types of conflict. One is not any higher or lower than the other, but we have person versus person, person versus self, person versus nature, which could be the environment, or it could be hurricane, flood, fire, the Arctic, any of those kinds of elements. And then we have person versus society and ideas. So there we see person versus, say, the racism, the gender issues, the, you know, environmentalists, or any of a number of things that could have to do with political, religious, anything that has to do with society and ideas falls under that. And then, of course, we've talked before that some of our most memorable novels will have a combination of at least 3, if not all 4 in some places, but at least 3, you know, and especially the one that is probably what most readers, according to Faulkner, who gets credit for saying that the one that conflict that everyone wants to read about is the human heart in conflict with itself. Yeah. Which is that person versus self. Motivation, you know, just like, you know, if you're prosecuting a murder trial, you want to have some sort of, you know, like what was the witness, what was the, you know, defendant's motivation behind this, or what could have been the motivation. So, you know, we need some sort of motivation for what is moving our protagonist or antagonist to do some of the things that they're doing, and to take some of the steps that they're taking. Like, what is motivating them to do these things? And a lot of that comes from knowing our characters so well that we're able to seamlessly pull in some of their backstory in life without dipping into paragraphs and pages of flashbacks. But we do need to know what their motivation is, what drives them. And then symbolism. Symbolism can be, you know, the similes, the metaphors. It can also be a form of repetition. So a lot of times what we forget is that there's no accident that something is named by a writer or described by a writer in a story or in a scene with particular colors. So that's never an accident. Now, the writer may not recall consciously why he or she chose to describe something and had white in there so often, but when they go deeper, they realize that what's being infused throughout the novel are these things that have to do with white. Maybe it's some sort of religious theme that ends up emerging. So when you see a color, you want to pay attention. When you see a number of something, you want to pay attention, because typically it has another meaning and it's serving a deeper purpose. Does that make sense? So anytime we see 3, what do we think of? We think of the Trinity, right? Almost all of us think of the Trinity when we see 3 in something. And that's important because that's part of our culture, our religious background for many of us, not for everybody, but for many of us. And so a lot of time, 3 is also associated with creativity. So when we see the number 3 and we read it and it's referenced several times or several ways where something is described in 3 ways, it starts to become infused into our consciousness as we're reading. And we begin to grab on and hold on to a deeper and broader understanding of what's going on within the novel. And this is how we want our readers to feel connected to material that we're writing, right? Yeah. And so if we are able to recognize these are the craft elements and how are they showing up and how are they being used by other great writers, then we go back and look at our own current work in progress with that same idea in mind, and where am I doing that? And it's possible, quite possible, that we're already doing a lot of these things, and a lot of these things incredibly well, and we're not even consciously aware of it. We've taught ourselves, or it's been infused into us for so long, and that's not bad. Keep doing it. But are there areas that we're not unconsciously aware of? You know, so are we not consciously aware of symbolism and how we might infuse some of that into our story? Are we not consciously aware of what the conflicts really are, or we're just kind of like writing and, you know, or are we not consciously aware of what the motivations are? So this is where the more conscious we become as readers and writers, the more we're able to actually infuse more within our own writing, to ensure that what we're writing is coming through to the reader with as much depth and breadth as we want possible. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Isn't that everyone's goal? You know, we want to write something and we want it to resonate, right? And we want people to love it. You know, we don't want them to read it and go, oh, I hated that. Unless they hated it for all the right reasons, you know, like, wow, I really learned something. I really hated that character. And that's okay to have a protagonist, or, you know, who's really an antagonist or an unreliable narrator and everybody hates. But you want them to feel like, I'll never forget that book. I'll never forget that book, and I'll never forget how it made me feel. But damn, I hated that book, but damn, it was a good book. You know, that kind of thing. I mean, that's okay too. The bottom line is we want to make sure that our readers come away from our reading with as much as possible. We want to make sure we have given them everything when it comes to craft. Is it all in there? Okay. So then we have the writing elements. And the writing elements are what show up in everyday writing, period. Everything from a recipe to back of a soup can or whatever, you know, these are the writing elements. And this is word choice, spelling, grammar, punctuation, and it should be like sentence structure. I don't know if I put that one in here or not. Yeah, I did. Oh, and word. Oh, got word choice twice. Sorry about that. But here's where some of it begins to blur, because word choice could also relate to diction, right? And so sentence structure could also blur along with syntax and with pacing, because we as the writers get to control the speed at which our readers are going to read and digest our story. We do that because we control the pace, unless they skip ahead, get to the places with more white space, you know, the dialogue. But if they're not, then we're controlling the pace, because the longer the sentence, the more complex structure the sentence, the slower the read must be. The shorter the sentence, the faster the pacing, the more the movement, and we're speeding the reader through a story. Again, the longer, more complex sentence, the more we're slowing the pace down. So we as the writers need to be aware of how are we using sentence structure to determine the pace of our story. Are we enhancing and encouraging the reader to read fast here? We want them to feel the quickening. We want them to read faster. Or are we really wanting them to slow down a little bit because of how we want them to pull in this information and absorb the tone and some of these other elements? Does that make sense? Things that are not on here are things like scenes, because a scene is really taken in all of that in terms of craft. But a couple of other elements that I'm kind of surprised that, the experts don't have on here are like foreshadowing. I think foreshadowing is like an art form in and of itself. I mean, you either do it very well or you're too heavy-handed with it. But when it is done well, oh, it's masterful to foreshadow just that little bit that gives a hint at what's to come, right? And so foreshadowing could be a craft element that's not on the so-called approved list. I don't want to say flashback, but I will say, because everybody's so against flashbacks these days, but there's a way to bring in a tiny phrase that gives us a hint of the life that came before the moment we're reading. And that, in a sense, is a very artful flashback moment. It's just adding in that little phrase, prepositional phrase, or a sentence that just informs the reader that what the protagonist is going through right now is not the first time this has happened. And that sometimes is enough to give us that little tiny hint of the life that came before. Now, this wasn't the first time so-and-so had to deal with such and such, right? That is showing up in a student reading that I'm teaching right now by Octavia Butler. And the book, I think, is Kindred, maybe, or am I getting that mixed up with the Underground Railroad? But anyway, the character is basically saying she didn't listen the first time her mama told her to run. She's a slave. And this is, going back. And she didn't listen the second time when so-and-so told her to run. So see, already we're getting a little tiny bit of flashback. You see how it's done? It's not done in pages. It's not done where we're getting the whole scene of a flashback, but the third time she heard she better run, she ran, so that's how you can infuse a tiny moment of flashback that gives us that's how that novel opens. And it gives us a little bit about the life that has come before this moment when this character is now going to make a run for it. Okay, does that make sense? All righty. Okay, so is there anything anybody wants to say at this point, or any ideas or questions? Because where we would like to take you now is we're going to go over two sections of the book, two specific sections, and Judith's going to read those, and then we're going to break them apart. We're going to look at them as a craft, based on these elements that we're seeing here. Okay, is that good? All right, Judith, you ready?
Yes.
Oh, let me just go over this real quickly because I put this in here. So the basic tips for analyzing craft are this. After reading a scene, pause to consider which craft elements you're noticing. Ask yourself, hopefully with your own current work in mind, how might you use the same strategy or a craft element in your own particular, think of it, your own scene that comes to mind. How might you use that element more? Is that element in yours currently? And then during your next round of revising, mindfully integrate that strategy, if it's pacing or craft element, and ask, okay, what overall effect does this have on the scene and on the entire chapter? What did that one thing you changed and enhanced in terms of craft, what did it do to the scene? Did it change it? Did it alter it in some weird, strange way, or in a way that now you're just like, oh, this now alters the entire chapter. Oh my God, now this affects the entire manuscript. So these things are possible because once we're, really thinking about the theme or the tone or the motivation or any of those things within that scene that we haven't consciously thought of when we initially wrote it out, it could change a lot. I remember Dennis Lehane telling us when he was writing Mystic River that he had written this whole novel and he had it in his head what he thought the novel was about. And then one night during a thunderstorm, he was sitting on his back porch and, he had the cover over him and it was thunder and lightning and everything. And he said it was torrential downpour. And all of a sudden he heard, that's not what you're writing. What you're really writing about is gentrification. And he said he stopped and he went, what? Oh my God, that's what I'm really writing about. And so then he started writing out there in the middle of thunder and lightning. And he started going back and looking at where that could be infused in chapter 2 and where it could show up again in a little place in chapter 3. And suddenly he realized that he had to go through the whole book and find the little places that he could just massage in so deftly so that it was all in there. But it didn't come to him till after he'd already written the whole thing, what it was he was really writing about. And he said, he said, to an outsider, I would have looked like a madman out there hammering away and thundering and lightning going on. I didn't care. I was just writing. So, those are the things that all of a sudden one element of craft can change the entire novel for the better. And no, that's right. Possibly. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, ready for a few excerpts?
Yeah. So this first one is from early on in Hanny's chapter. And I'm not going to try to do the dialect in any particular way. Always like that been almost gone in these years since Mr. Lincoln's war ended. Slave driver and his whip, ma'am and the field gangs working from sea to can't see, leg irons and auction sales like the ones that took my people. All that's a thing in the barely back of my mind. Sometimes when I wake, I think all my people were just something I pretended, never real at all. But when I touch the 3 glass beads at my neck and I tell their names in the chant, Hardy, gone at Big Creek to a man from Woodville, Het at Jat, all the way down to Baby Rose and Mary Angel and Mama, it was real. We were real, a family together. I look off in the distant, wobble twixt a 6-year-old body and one that's 18 years growed, but not so much distant. Still skinny as if I was carved out of sticks. Mama always did say, Hanny, you stand behind the broom handle. I can't even see you there. Then she'd smile and touch my face and whisper, but you a beautiful child, always been pretty.
That's so beautiful. And this is not, believe it or not, this is not the heavy dialect that, say, Dennis was actually reading that night. His was where it was so hard. I don't even know how he got through it. Where these are full words here. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how best to describe it. You've probably seen it, heard it before, different example. It was more like something you would have read in Mark Twain's Huck Finn.
Sure.
Okay, and that's not this. Okay, this is quite different from what we read and say, from Jim in Mark Twain. Okay, that's the version of dialect you want to stay away from nowadays if you're going to bring that in. This is good. This is fine. So this, I don't think anybody would try to accuse, of culture appropriation. So what are some of the things that we notice first when we go back to our craft element? Anyone? Do we have a character? Do we have a plot? Do we have a setting? Whose point of view are we in? Right? Do we have a tone? What would we say the tone is?
Melancholy, sadness.
Yes, definitely. A lot of melancholy there, right? Okay. How about symbolism? Did anybody pick up on the symbolism?
The 3 beads.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, good. Yeah, that's never a mistake. I mean, remember that when you're the writer, you're actually creating all this. So why, I mean, you could have created anything. Why wasn't there just one? Why wasn't there 100? Why wasn't there 21 glass beads? Why are there just 3? You know? So you're doing this, and the more conscious you are aware of it, then the more you can ensure that it pays off later, which this does. Okay. So we call it plant and return, plant and return. You're planting these little seeds, cultivating them along the way. And so that by the time when they do cultivate, it just makes sense that it would have happened that way, of course, because all these little things have been planted for you. And then the garden shows up. Okay. Judith, why don't you go through and mention a couple of things that you noticed right off?
Well, I just at the beginning, I like always like that been almost gone in these years since Mr. Lincoln's war ended. This totally places us in the time of the story. But at the same time, her use of Mr. Lincoln places us in her worldview, that this
Right.
was an important and honored man. What knocked my socks off, and is the main first reason that this is the passage, is Ma'am and the field gangs working from sea to can't see.
Oh, love that.
And
Is
I
that
just,
not amazing? Yeah.
and I totally bought it as authentic dialect.
Yeah.
And she does it again several times in different ways, but I look off in the distant would be wobble twixt a 6-year-old body and one that's 18 years growed, but not so much distant. So of course, then the 3 glass beads is wonderful, and this is another really amazing example of handling backstory when she chants the names of the family that she lost. Her entire family was being taken by evil uncle or nephew from Mississippi to Texas. And he sold them one by one along the way. He sold a 1-year-old out from under its mother. And we've already heard that, but when she does this is in the bit that's in italics: Hardy gone at Big Creek to a man from Woodville, Het at Jat. I like it that it's italicized, and that I like it that it's backstory, and I like the economy. And I think the broken prose in these lines, just the incomplete sentences and then the very short sentences, all the way down to Baby Rose and Mary Angel and Mama. It was real. We were real. I mean, this is heartbreaking stuff. So economical, so profoundly emotional without ever saying, my emotion is grief. My emotion is loss.
Exactly.
And I love her. Still skinny as if I was carved out of sticks. And feeling the mother's love. And Les, what are you thinking?
That last paragraph, her family's being sold off piecemeal,
Yes.
and the only thing the mother can give her are those words that you are a beautiful child.
Mhm,
You can't, no one can take that from you.
mhm.
So, That's so sad
Yeah,
because she knows that bond could be broken at any time.
right. The Hanny's losses pervade the book, and she recovers because of the Book of Lost Friends. Because of that, she is able to recover many, but not all. So there's some joy and but still some profound sadness.
And what we're seeing here too is a way of showing humanity, because a lot of times, you know, it's the situation where it happened to other people, it didn't happen to us, therefore we can't empathize. You know, there's a lot of times, you know, that we sense that from other people, that if it didn't happen to them, they can't quite empathize. And this brings the situation into an awareness of the how could you not empathize with
Yeah.
this. And this is what showing rather than the telling, this is what the showing, even though she's actually telling us, but she's really showing us in a sense of what she has gone through. And if you can't empathize with this by the time you get to that final paragraph, you know, that's tough. You know, you'd be a tough bird. Nobody could break through.
Well, I think this is one of the many places where present tense adds to the immediacy of what we as readers are experiencing. And I think it adds to how intensely we experience what Hanny is feeling.
Okay. Is there anything else anybody would want to point out? Now, in this case, the writer is doing different things with dialogue. The writer has chosen to, you know, use, even though she's remembering back to what was said to her, she's using that in italics. That's fine as long as that style stays consistent with how she's doing that, because she's setting up her own style for this character in the book. So, you know, the one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to put the interior thoughts in quotation marks. That's the one thing you don't do.
Right.
Okay. And I see that coming all the time. And I'm thinking, no. Or feeling as if every single internal thought has to be in italics. That's not the case either. All of this, if you think about it, is all in her mind. But there are only certain things that are italicized. Okay. So it's all coming from within her mind at this time, in her memory.
Yeah. And this is what we call close first person.
Yeah.
Would you say that the first person really makes you feel like you're there with them instead of hearing a story?
Yeah,
Would that be
you're
accurate?
really trapped. You're trapped into that person's mindset, that person's mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You're not viewing it from like third, you're not viewing it from afar. You're actually in that person. You're inhabiting that person's mind at that point.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's why I like first person.
I mean, when it's done well, I mean, who doesn't? But, you know, it's got to be, it's hard to write. It's got to be done well. Okay. Now let's jump ahead on page 28 to Benny's chapter. If you want to go to that page, if you've got your book handy.
This is this looks kind of long here, but the sentences are so short. I don't think it's much longer than the previous selection.
Yeah, I'm going to have to make sure I can keep scrolling for you. Okay.
Okay. A man-sized hand reaches out, grasps air, stretches farther, closes over my arm. Miss, I don't feel so. The next thing I know, Lil Ray is slumped against the frame and we're going down. I do my best to break the fall as a million things run through my mind. Overexcitement, drugs, an illness, theatrics. Lil Ray's eyes moisten. He gives me the terrified look of a toddler lost in the grocery store, searching for his mom. Lil Ray, what's going on? No response. I turn and shout into the classroom. Does he have a health problem? No one answers. Are you sick? We're nose to nose now. I get, hungry. Do you carry medicine? Does the nurse have medicine for you? Do we even have a school nurse? Have you been to a doctor? I just get hungry. When did you last eat? Lunch yesterday. Why didn't you have breakfast this morning? Nothing in the pantry. Why didn't you have supper last night? Deep creases line his sweat-soaked forehead. He blinks at me, blinks again. Nothing in the pantry. My mind speeds full throttle into the brick wall of reality. I don't even have time to put on the brakes and soften the impact. Pantry, pantry, pantry. Nothing in the pantry. I feel sick.
So what do we notice in this when it comes to craft?
Well, there's the repetition you were talking about with the word pantry.
Yeah. Good. So the word choice, there, the repetition, the pacing. What else do we notice? What of our craft elements, if we go back up here? We have characters, we have plot. We are, what we do know at this point, if we're in a classroom, right? So we do have the setting, we're in a classroom. Okay. Craft element.
Yeah. I like the idea of the translation. She has to translate pantry, and she has to translate a life in which a kid doesn't have food.
Yeah.
And so you can just say, here's a character they're out of water, they're like,
exactly.
She's in she's not in Kansas anymore.
Mm.
Yeah. And it never apparently dawned on her when she's asking these questions. That a child would have gone, without food for a reason other than choice. I mean, she's not even put that together yet.
Yeah. So.
Judith, you want to go over some things in particular that jumped out at you?
Yeah, so much to admire in this very efficient piece of writing. The first overall thing that I really love about it is almost the entire event is created for us with dialogue. And the way she does the dialogue, everything is every sentence is so short, so efficient, so fast that this unwinds in front of us at high speed, which leads her up to near the end. My mind speeds full throttle into the brick wall of reality. I loved that. She didn't even have time to put on the brakes and soften the impact because she gets it now.
And she's already, in a scene prior to this, she's already been in a car accident, right?
Right.
Oh, so yeah. It's another way of bringing back that attention. Yeah. In a different way.
Yeah. In fact, my mind speeding full throttle is like an image that fits in with the accident that she was in her car. In the first line, I love the efficiency and brevity of the action verbs. Reaches out, grasps air, stretches farther, closes over my arm. I'd love to have written that sentence.
Yeah, and that draws attention back to the craft element of action, right? So we have action, we have pacing, we have description. We have a lot of craft in that single sentence that's going on. A lot.
And I like her trying to figure out as she's falling what's going on with him. Overexcitement, drugs and illness, theatrics. I mean, she's really grasping for an answer. And instead of emotion, she doesn't tell us what his emotion is or hers, but she shows us. He gives me the terrified look of a toddler lost in the grocery store searching for his mom. This works on a lot of levels, but one of the things that it does is make us feel sympathy for this child. He looks like a lost child in the grocery store.
And when we think about the context of where this fits into the overall, prior to this, a lot of his classmates are finding whatever excuse they can to run out of class to go to early lunch, right? And so here is somebody who's hungry, and she's already basically thrown her body across the door to keep anybody else from running down the hall. And then this larger student is about to pass out. So at first she's not really quite sure. But when he gives that terrified look of a toddler lost in a grocery store searching for his mom, that tells us he's not faking this. There's something deeper going on here.
Right. Then I just love a little one-liner paragraph. When she asked the class, does he have a health problem? No one answers. They have not been cooperating with her at all. They're not, if they knew, they're not going to answer. And they know, don't you think? But anyway, the next line, are you sick? We're nose to nose now. She's giving us a scene like we're watching a movie. And we have to extrapolate the emotions that she's going through from the way things look. I particularly like the italicized line bit in Do You Carry Medicine? And then, do we even have a school nurse? She's pissed off at the school. And I like this way of showing her anger, almost disgust, without saying she's disgusted with the conditions that she's seeing at the school. This is so much more efficient. And I love the hesitations in the next word. I just get hungry. And it touched me then. And I didn't, when he was saying nothing in the pantry, I didn't get it either. Like her, I didn't get it. But I like when she asks him that question, why didn't you have supper last night? You see his embarrassment, how awkward he feels, how hard it is to admit how poor he is and what he's suffering. And then, of course, the last three lines, the two italicized lines, because of the way she does them, one short line, another short line, that is making almost the same impact on us as readers as it makes on Benny as she experiences this burst of insight. And
so thanks so much, Judith. I know we're getting close on time. Let's jump back up here and look at those craft elements and everything that she just brought out. So we have all of this from Benny's point of view. When we think about how she's using the dialogue, how she's using action, the word choice, his word choice, diction, pantry for pantry, or how she's hearing it. Anyway, she's hearing it as pantry instead of pantry at first. So, and certainly the action that's going on. We can see all of these different craft elements going on at one time. Often we're not quite aware, and maybe when we're writing a first draft, we might not have nearly as many of those in there. And it may be later that we go back and we start to think, I need to speed up this scene. I need to create a little bit more here that will resonate for a reader, that makes a little bit more sense. Or maybe I'm telling too much and not showing enough through here in terms of action. But unless we're aware of all of these craft elements and we're aware of looking for them in our own stories, then chances are they might not all get in there. So you know, this is one of the reasons why we want to really think about a scene from our own personal work through the lens of all this, and then analyze it for ourselves, just like Judith has done with these last two scenes. You know, what's in there? You know, am I showing instead of telling? Is the pace, is the style right? Is the tone right? You know, is there a right balance between exposition and dialogue? Am I making the dialogue do the exposition, which is a big no-no? So, you know, the things to be looking for. I am going to stop sharing that for a second. So, oh, everybody's still here. Hi.
Yay.
Nobody left. Nobody quit on us. Okay. Is that helping? You can unmute. Is that helping at all? Seriously? I mean, are you starting to see that, you know, when we break it down into the various elements, we can start to analyze them and see them and name them for what they are, and then go back. It's kind of looking at a Monet. You know, if you stand back far enough, you see the overall image, but you get really close and all you see are the strokes, right? Right? Yeah.
You know,
That's what
Tracy, I'm sorry, but
no, go ahead.
in that last piece you read, it seems to me that that very last line to me was brilliant. It seems like, I should say, added that last line, because it seems like it could have stopped.
Yeah.
Right before that, and yet she says, "I feel sick."
Yeah.
With the weight of the new knowledge
Exactly.
and understanding. Yeah, it just about moves me to tears. I cried a number of times in reading this novel. Let me say one more thing about the novel. The way I was introduced to the novel was through a book club. And we were going to talk a bit about ways to motivate your reading. I am in 2 book clubs, and I'm now trying to swap back and forth and get them to read some of the same books to cut down on how much I have to read. But I'm constantly being introduced to authors I never heard of, and who are amazing, titles I never heard of, who are award-winning. It's a wonderful thing to get together with a group of like-minded readers and see how differently we all react to the stories that are chosen for us. There is, here in Chatham County, we have a library system that includes the library at CCCC in Pittsburgh, the Wren Library here in Siler City, and Goldston Library in the southeastern part of the county. And they sponsor book clubs. The library sponsors book clubs. So you go to the book club and talk with your new friends about the book that you ordered and was waiting for you at the end of the session. So your next book is already waiting for you when you finish the session, and you don't have to buy books. You just have to return them after you finish reading them. And the librarians do a brilliant job of making a good variety of books available, and then the book club itself gets to choose. So we recommend book clubs, and Tracy has other recommendations for enhancing.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like golfers have this. Anybody play golf? It seems like golfers have this thing where they say, if you want to become a better golfer, then you play with better golfers. That's the way you become a better golfer.
Oh.
So that's what they say in golf. So one of the things I feel like is, if I want to be a better writer, I need to be immersed in writing that I know at this stage of my life is better than mine. And so what I have done in the past is I've set a reading goal where I decided I was going to read all the Pulitzer Prize winners for a decade, 10 books, 10 novels. If I had read that novel, then I flipped over to the nonfiction winner of the Pulitzer Prize that year. Not 1 year had I read both. So then, you know, you set a goal. I'm going to read the National Book Award winners, or I'm going to read the Booker Man Prize winners, or the Nobel Prize winners. But these are books that are going to stand the test of time. And so they've been adjudicated as, for a number of reasons, to be the best of all the best submitted throughout that year. So if I want to be a better golfer, if I want to be a better writer, I need to be immersed with better writers, right? And so sometimes, I mean, while writing workshops are great and it's important to get feedback from other writers, what we sometimes have to also admit to ourselves is, are these writers winning Pulitzer Prize awards, right? So it's fine to have other people's opinions about our work and our writing and be part of those things. But it's also important that we take that extra time to associate with writers who we know are the best of the best, right? So that's how you can also find and set yourselves up for your own writing goals. And of course, it's always important to read in your own genre so that you understand what the tropes are in your own genre, because science fiction has tropes, romance has tropes, young adult has tropes. Every genre has tropes. And in order for them not to come across as cliche, we want to know what the standard tropes are within the particular genre that we're writing. So, but remember the golfing analogy. If you want to be a better golfer, you play with better golfers. If you want to be a better writer, you associate or you read writers whose work is being admired and designated that will stand the test of time for a number of reasons. With that, we are like,
Tracy, can I add one more thing in here about Lisa Wingate? Because I've read several of her books, and one of the things I like about her, she finds these little nuggets in history that most people don't know about, and then she builds an entire story. If you've not read her book, Before We Were Yours, it is amazing. And talk about a tearjerker and emotional, and it's all based on historical fact. Just an incredible, incredible story.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Any other comments? Anything anybody feels like they want to share or dispute or add or anything?
Well, it's a small thing, but for me, it's big. Writing historical fiction. I did a lot of reading because I was interested in the field. And then I wrote, and then I read this, and I realized that one of the most interesting parts of this story is in the back where she lists her sources. And then she talks about the feelings she had when she read these sources. And I got nothing of that. I didn't keep a record, and I don't even remember where I read some of this stuff. So there's a lesson learned.
Good.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's several things that I like about this book apart from the novel itself. And as you say, Bonnie, her note at the end about how she came up with this material is a model for a way for us to behave as writers, but also for what we might need to insert at the end of our novel. And because I always read acknowledgments and sources and everything just to learn how it's done. And of course,
all right, sorry.
No, I'm done.
We've taken you over time, and we don't want to do that. But is there anything else anyone wants to say? Or yes, Tom.
Yeah, no, I've really gotten a lot out of this. Thank you so much. Just looking at those tears, not boohoo tears, but the 3 tears.
Yeah.
I realized that I don't know if you were intending to send out the handout for this, but I just feel like I'd really like that the tears to be able to use as a checklist, because it just put a lot of light on things that I disregard in my process. And so I was very sort of energized to see what was said about the different tiers. So anyway.
Yes, we'll send that out, and there's a bonus, because what you didn't get to see was what's also part of that handout are Judith's comments and notes on those 2 segments that we just read. So you'll see her. I thought they were so good. I told her, I said, we're gonna give them an extra bonus.
Okay.
So not only will you see the excerpts, but then you'll see them again with all of her comments pointing out craft on the sides, in the margins. So we'll send it out.
Great, thank you.
Okay. All right, everybody. So
thanks everybody for showing up.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank Judith for coming up with this idea. And I hope to see some of you for the last Tuesday night session. So come if you're able. All right. Bye, everybody.